Late one afternoon in the summer of 2014, a pawn shop owner was updating his inventory logs when the bell above the front door jingled. A young couple walked inside and approached the counter, and the young man said he had a few items to sell. Then he proceeded to open a drawstring bag and dump the contents onto the counter. There was a collection of gold chains, rings, and watches, and many of the pieces were twisted and mangled. Instantly, the hair on the pawn shop owner's neck stood up, because everything about this interaction, from the large quantity of damaged jewelry to the careless way the pieces had been thrown in a bag together, told him that these items were stolen. And this made the owner extremely nervous because he had cash in the register and didn't know what these thieves might be capable of. He needed to get them out of the store quickly without revealing that he was onto them. So he told the couple he didn't have enough cash to buy the jewelry right now, but he would send some pictures of the jewelry to his broker to see if maybe they were interested. The couple agreed and let him take the photos. And then after the photos were taken and the couple had left, the owner called the police. And it soon became clear his gut instincts were right. However, he'd stumbled onto something much bigger than just theft, because it would turn out this jewelry was linked to a murder case. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please change all the hotkey commands on the Follow Button's computer so that every single command just restarts the computer. Okay, let's get into today's story. One afternoon in mid-July 2014, 59-year-old Jack Parks and his fiancée, Carol LaPaya, walked through their neighborhood of Kennedy Township, Pennsylvania. Jack sported a black fedora, wireframe glasses, and a lopsided grin beneath a graying mustache. Carol hung on his arm, smiling at how her engagement ring sparkled in the sunlight. As they walked, they passed by several neighbors who were outside doing yard work or talking. Jack and Carol waved to each person as they passed, and everyone waved back. Their neighborhood was a close-knit, working-class community 10 miles outside of Pittsburgh, and everybody seemed to know each other. In fact, Jack even had family on this street. One of his nephews, Bradley Johnson, lived nearby. As Jack and Carol passed by Bradley's house, Jack slowed down, trying to see if Bradley was home. His nephew had mentioned wanting to talk to him in person about something serious and urgent, but Jack could see that the house was empty, so that conversation would have to wait. Which was fine, because today, Jack and Carol were on a mission. Inside of Carol's purse was a large stack of wedding invitations, and they were on their way to drop these invitations in the mail, which was huge for them, because their wedding had been an unusually long time coming. So Jack and Carol had met at a bar 25 years ago. They'd fallen for each other quickly, but Jack had dragged his feet on proposing. And then, when he had felt ready, Carol was swamped at work. Then Jack was busy. The timing was just always bad, and the longer they put marriage off, the less important it seemed. And anyways, they were in love and totally committed to each other. They didn't need a marriage license to prove that. But last February, Jack's mother had passed away. Her death had made him realize that he wasn't getting any younger, and he really wanted to marry the woman he'd loved for decades. So, a few months ago, he'd finally proposed. And ever since, their days had been consumed with wedding preparations. They had the venue, the dress, and the rings, and now it was finally time to send out the invitations. The couple came to the end of the block and stopped in front of the mailbox. Carol took the envelopes from her purse and then joked that this was their last chance to cross anyone off their invite list. Jack just laughed and said they were not cutting anyone. So Carol pushed the envelopes through the mailbox slot until only one invitation remained. Carol hesitated for a second, looking at the name on that last envelope. It was her nephew, a 22-year-old named Michael LaPaya. She and Jack had been angry at Michael this whole past year. Their broken relationship with him was a sore spot for both of them. So Jack and Carol did not have children of their own, but they'd always doted on their nieces and nephews. When the kids were younger, Jack and Carol would have them over for slumber parties where they'd stay up late watching movies and eating popcorn, and as the kids got older, they'd all stayed close. Except for Michael. A few years back, Michael had started drifting away from Jack and Carol and the rest of the family, and getting into lots of trouble. He joined the army, but gotten dishonorably discharged for marijuana possession, and ever since, he'd suffered from PTSD and began experimenting with harder drugs. But that was actually not what caused the rift. Jack and Carol had supported Michael, even through his struggles, until one day the previous September. During a Labor Day party that Jack and Carol had hosted, guests had seen Michael go into the couple's bedroom. And when the party was over, Carol had discovered that her expensive jewelry was missing. Jack and Carol had confronted Michael, who denied taking anything, but they hadn't believed him. They told him he was no longer welcome in their home, and things had been extremely tense between them ever since. But now, Jack and Carol were ready to make amends by inviting Michael to their wedding. So, standing on the sidewalk, Carol took a deep breath and then dropped Michael's invitation into the mailbox. And suddenly, both Jack and Carol felt a whole lot lighter. The invitations were out, and good things were ahead. Jack and Carol turned away from the mailbox and began heading back home. As they reached their driveway, Jack waved to a few men standing directly across the street, outside of a small factory called Silver Star Meats. The workers were outside in their aprons smoking, and they waved back. Jack was about to go over and talk to them when he noticed Carol's irritated expression, and so he thought better of it. Jack liked the guys from the factory, but he knew they made Carol uncomfortable. She hated that they took their smoke breaks so close to their house, and she thought their blood-stained aprons were kind of unsettling. So Jack just turned away, and then he and Carol walked up their porch steps and into their house. A few days later, on Monday, July 21st, Carol sat at her desk at work, reviewing her to-do list for the wedding. The ceremony was just 6 weeks away, and there was still a lot to figure out. But then, at 10:45 a.m., her cell phone rang. And to her surprise, it was Jack's realtor. Jack had hired this realtor to sell his mother's house after she had died, and now the realtor said some potential buyers wanted to see the house that afternoon. She wanted Jack and Carol to meet her there at 4 p.m. This was all good news, because Carol and Jack had been eager to sell that house as quickly as possible. But before hanging up, Carol asked why the realtor called her instead of calling Jack. The realtor said they did call Jack first. He just didn't answer. This seemed odd to Carol. As soon as she hung up, she tried Jack's cell phone, and it rang several times before going to voicemail. She left him a message, then hung up and called the house. And as it rang, she expected to hear Jack's voice any second, but again, the call went to voicemail. Carol just sat there, trying to ignore the sick feeling of dread in her stomach. Jack knew what a worrier she could be, so he always answered her calls. But she told herself that maybe he was in the shower, or maybe outside mowing the grass without his phone on him. He would probably call her back any minute. But the clock kept ticking, and by noon, Jack still had not called. And so Carol tried him again, but he still didn't answer. Frustrated, she dropped her phone back in her purse and just focused on her computer, trying to ignore her mounting anxiety. But by 2:30 p.m., when still Jack had not called, so now it's been 3.5 hours since that first missed call, Carol just couldn't take it anymore. So she left work and began heading straight home. 20 minutes later, Carol pulled up outside of her and Jack's house. And right away, she saw that the garage door was open and Jack's car was inside, which meant he had to be home. Carol felt relieved. She was sure Jack would explain why he had missed her calls, and better yet, they'd still be able to make their 4 p.m. appointment with their realtor. But as Carol got out of her car and started up the walkway, she saw something that made her stomach drop all over again. So Jack and Carol's front porch was enclosed by a gate, and both Jack and Carol always kept the gate closed because their dog was a runner, and they wanted to make sure he didn't get out. But now Carol saw the gate was wide open. Carol rushed through the gate to the front door and turned the knob. But even though the doorknob turned, meaning it was unlocked, the door didn't budge when she pushed on it. That's when Carol realized the deadbolt inside, which they never used, must be locked. And now her anxiety turned to actual fear. Between the deadbolt, the open gate, and Jack not answering his phone, she was certain something had to be wrong here. Carol's hands shook as she dug through her purse for the house key, then struggled to get it into the lock. Finally she did, the deadbolt turned, and the door swung open. Carol stepped inside with her heart pounding, but the house was silent and still. She took a few steps further in, and then her eyes suddenly fell on something under the coffee table inside of the living room. For a second, her brain couldn't even compute what she was looking at. But then, when it clicked, she let out a scream. Because underneath the coffee table was Jack. He was lying face down on the carpet with a pool of blood under his head. Carol rushed over to Jack and shook him, but he didn't move or make a sound. And so in a panic, she found her phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher picked up, Carol shouted that there'd been some kind of horrible accident. Her fiancé must have fallen and hit his head on the coffee table. And she begged the dispatcher to please send help now. Moments later, police and first responders arrived, and they had to physically drag Carol away from Jack's side. Carol watched as they knelt beside her fiancé and checked for a pulse, but they didn't find one. Carol's world crumbled. She knew Jack was dead. A short while later, Detective Lori McKeel of the Allegheny County Homicide Unit arrived on the scene. A perimeter was already established, and the house was crawling with police. But before McKeel went in, she looked around outside. Neighbors were watching the activity from their front lawns, and McKeel noticed a specific group of people huddled together on the sidewalk, consoling a sobbing woman whose hands were covered in blood. McKeel guessed this must be the victim's partner, and the people around her were her family. But before speaking to her, the detective quickly made her way across the yard and went inside of the house. Inside, officers and forensic techs searched the front room for evidence. McKeel had already been briefed on this case, so she knew the victim's name was Jack Parks, and his fiancée had found him dead after an apparent fall. McKeel went into the living room, where Jack's body lay face up, partially underneath the coffee table. There was a lot of blood, and at first glance, a fall didn't seem out of the question. However, when she crouched down to get a better look, she found a small hole behind Jack's right ear, toward the back of his skull. It was a gunshot wound, which meant this was no accidental fall. This was a murder. McKeel stood up and told the other investigators nearby to keep their eyes peeled for bullet casings or a gun. Then she continued scanning the house. The house was lived in, but relatively neat, with boxes of what looked like wedding favors stacked in the hall. But when McKeel stepped inside of the master bedroom, she saw this room had been totally ransacked. Dressers were overturned and drawers were pulled out. Several jewelry boxes lay empty and discarded on the carpet. Either this was a robbery, or someone had staged the scene to make it look like one. As McKeel made her way back to the living room, she saw several photos of what looked like a seemingly loving couple about to get married. But McKeel's training told her not to take anything at face value. Every relationship had its problems, and a deadline like a wedding could bring tension to the surface. So before McKeel did anything else, she wanted to speak to Jack's fiancé. If there were any skeletons in the couple's closet, She needed to know about them. Later that afternoon, Detective McKeel sat with Carol in an interview room at the police station. McKeel knew that so far, nobody had told Carol much of anything, including the fact that Jack's death was a murder, not an accidental fall. And from McKeel's point of view, this was a good thing. The romantic partner was always the primary suspect in a murder. And so McKeel wanted to study how Carol behaved in their interview before she told Carol anything about the investigation. So McKeel started slowly, asking basic questions about Carol's relationship with Jack. But as Carol calmed down and opened up, McKeel began to probe deeper. She asked if either Carol or Jack was getting cold feet about their wedding. And why did it take them so long to get engaged? Were there suspicions of infidelity? What about money problems? McKeel watched Carol for any hint of defensiveness or anger. But while Carol did deny having any problems with Jack, she didn't seem mad at being asked about it. She just seemed confused. So, McKeel decided to ask a question that she knew would increase the pressure, by making it obvious that Carol was now a suspect in a murder. The detective looked into Carol's eyes and asked her if she owned a gun. And at this, Carol froze. After a second, she asked why she was being questioned about a gun when her fiancé had fallen. McKeel stayed quiet and watched as Carol's expression changed from confusion to understanding. Carol just looked at McKeel and said, "Are you saying Jack was shot?" And then Carol just began sobbing. Even though McKeel could not officially rule Carol out as a suspect yet, she did think Carol's reaction to this was very genuine. So McKeel handed Carol a box of tissues and asked in a gentle voice if Jack had any enemies. Through tears, Carol said no. In fact, if anything, Jack was sometimes too friendly. Recently, Carol said she'd come home to find Jack hanging out in the living room with one of the workers from the factory across the street. Carol said she'd been mad at him for letting a stranger inside of their home. And then after that, Carol just broke into more sobs. McKeel narrowed her eyes as she thought back to Jack and Carol's ransacked bedroom. Crime scene techs were still processing the scene, but it had looked like theft was at least part of the motive. So if Jack really had no enemies and his murder was not personal, then this being a robbery by a stranger, like a factory worker, was a definite possibility. McKeel knew that if Jack and Carol's home really had been robbed during this murder, then whoever did the robbery would likely try to unload the stolen goods quickly. And the easiest way to do that was to sell them to a local pawn shop. So, the day after Jack's murder, McKeel got a list of the items missing from Jack and Carol's home, which included several expensive watches, rings, and other pieces of jewelry, and contacted every pawn shop in the immediate area. But none of them claimed to have any of the missing jewelry yet, so McKeel left descriptions of the items along with their number. McKeel also contacted the City of Pittsburgh Pawn Division, which kept an extensive database of pawned items, and gave them descriptions of the stolen jewelry as well. It was sort of like she was fishing, and so McKeel knew she had to be patient. So, while she waited to hear back, she began looking into the workers from the Silver Star Meats Factory. Within a few days of the murder, McKeel led a team of officers to that factory. And as soon as she stepped out of her car, she could see that anybody standing right outside of the factory would have a clear view of Jack and Carol's front door and garage. From speaking to Carol, she knew Jack had been friendly with several factory employees, and on at least one occasion had invited them into his home. And so those types of visits would have been perfect opportunities to learn the layout of Jack and Carol's house and to figure out where they kept their valuables. Once inside the factory, McKeel and her officers began interviewing close to 40 workers, one by one. And pretty quickly, they identified the man who'd been invited by Jack into their home. His name was Ronald Blevins, and he had a criminal history of petty theft and assault. To McKeel, this was promising, but Blevins had not been at work on the day of Jack's murder because he was on a scheduled vacation. Now, McKeel did not think this made him any less of a suspect, but this early in the case, there wasn't any physical evidence to connect him to the crime, so she couldn't arrest him. As McKeel and her team left the meat factory, she felt a bit deflated. She really needed the forensics to come back if she was going to make any real progress on this case. Fortunately, though, there would be new evidence for her waiting back at the station. A copy of Jack's autopsy report was sitting on McKeel's desk. She opened it and began reading. And right away, she saw something important. Other than the gunshot wound, there were no bruises or scratches found anywhere on Jack's body. There was no sign of a struggle at all. And so McKeel knew this could mean that the killer broke into the house and then surprised Jack and shot him from behind, or it could mean Jack knew his killer and had let this person inside of his house. McKeel kept on reading the report, and as she got towards the end of it, her eyes went wide. The coroner had made a major discovery. A bullet had been extracted from Jack's skull, and they determined it came from a .380 caliber handgun. This was extremely helpful. McKeel still did not have the actual murder weapon, but now she knew what kind of gun she was looking for. And so she wanted to find out if somebody close to Jack, someone let's say he would have welcomed into his home, owned a gun like that. Over the next few days, Detective McKeel interviewed Jack's friends and family, and most of them echoed Carol's comments that Jack got along with everybody. And no one McKeel met with claimed to own a .380 caliber handgun. And so McKeel felt like she was quickly running into yet another dead end. That was until a few people mentioned a fight Jack had had with Carol's nephew at a Labor Day party. And also folks mentioned that one of Jack's nephews, so a different nephew, was looking to hash out a serious and urgent matter with his uncle in the days right before the murder. The people who mentioned those two nephews said that the nephews had been really close with Jack for most of their lives. But McKeel knew those relationships could have turned bad as soon as jewelry or money got involved. So she went to interview both men immediately. The first house she went to belonged to Carol's nephew, Michael Lapaya, the Army veteran who Jack and Carol had accused of stealing at their Labor Day party. When she began questioning Michael, he didn't deny that he and his uncle had a falling out. But he also insisted Jack was wrong about him stealing. More importantly, though, Michael denied having anything to do with Jack's death. He said he'd been busy on the day of the murder, at a doctor's appointment to treat his PTSD, and then he had also gone shopping with his girlfriend. And he showed McKeel receipts to prove it. And also, Michael did admit that he had lots of guns, and he knew how to use them after his time in the military. However, the one gun he didn't own was a .380 caliber handgun. After the interview, McKeel contacted the Veterans Affairs Medical Center and confirmed that Michael attended his appointment on the day of the murder. She was also able to verify that charges had been made on his credit card in a different city around the time of Jack's death. All in all, Michael's alibi seemed solid. So, Detective McKeel headed back to Jack and Carol's neighborhood to meet with the second nephew that Jack's friends and family had mentioned. This was Jack's nephew, Bradley, the one who lived on the same street and had been apparently wanting to speak with Jack in person about something serious and urgent. Now, from what other people had already told her, McKeel knew Bradley was mad at Jack for selling his mother's house, because Bradley thought the property should stay in the family. She also knew Bradley and Carol didn't really get along. To McKeel, this sounded like a pretty deep-rooted dispute, and she expected Bradley to be cagey when they spoke about it. However, once they sat down at Bradley's kitchen table, what Bradley actually said blew McKeel away. Right off the bat, Bradley said that at 10:30 a.m. on July 21st, which was the day of the murder, he'd waited until Carol had left for work and then walked over to Jack's house to confront him. Bradley said once Jack let him inside, he'd immediately asked Jack to halt the sale of his grandmother's house. Bradley was struggling financially and wanted to move into his grandmother's house with his girlfriend to save money. Bradley said Jack seemed open to the idea, but he refused to make a decision right then because he wanted to speak to Carol first. And at that point, Bradley knew he was not going to get the house, because he knew Carol would not like the idea and she would convince Jack to keep trying to sell the house. So Bradley told McKeel he'd just given up and left Jack's house sometime around 11:15 a.m., a little more than 3 hours before Carol would arrive home and find Jack dead. As Bradley finished up the story, McKeel was stunned silent. Bradley had just openly confessed to being inside of Jack's home, alone with him, on the day Jack died. And also, Bradley admitted that he had been there arguing over a property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But, amazingly, Bradley still wasn't done with his story. Just as McKeel was about to leave, he casually revealed one more fact. He told her that he did in fact own a .380 caliber handgun. McKeel confiscated Bradley's gun, then raced back to the station to have it analyzed by the ballistics lab to see if it was the murder weapon. It would take a while for the results to come in, but McKeel barely had to wait before she got another huge break in the case. That day, a member of McKeel's team told her he'd finally received a call back from a pawnshop owner in a nearby town. According to that owner, a young couple had come into their shop on July 21st, the day of Jack's murder. And this couple had wanted to sell a bunch of jewelry, including gold chains and rings. And the owner noticed that several of these pieces had been smashed and mangled, which made the owner suspect that these could be stolen. And so as a result, he had not purchased these pieces of jewelry, but he'd convinced the couple to let him take a few photos of the jewelry, and then after the couple left, he contacted the police in the area. And it had taken 3 days for those police to connect the incident to Jack's case and then get in touch with McKeel's team. But as soon as McKeel got this news, she went straight to the pawn shop to review the photos of the potentially stolen items. And when she saw these photos, there was no doubt that was Jack's jewelry. Now, this pawn shop did not have a security camera, so there was no footage of the couple who tried to sell Jack's stuff. But McKeel showed the pawn shop owner some photos of local criminals along with dozens of people of interest in Jack's murder case, which included Jack's nephew Bradley. And as these pictures were being shown, the owner suddenly stopped McKeel and pointed out one person in particular and said, "Yep, that's the man I saw." And to McKeel's surprise, it was not Bradley. The man the pawn shop owner picked out was named Brian Gibbons. He had a record of theft, and the police knew of him, but they hadn't remotely considered him as a suspect in Jack's murder because Brian had no known connections to Jack. But now, armed with this new information, McKeel left the pawn shop and headed to Brian's house. And as soon as Brian saw her, McKeel could tell she'd taken him by surprise. Brian denied having any knowledge of the murder, but when McKeel looked in his bedroom, it was absolutely littered with purses and jewelry. None of the items belonged to Jack or Carol, but a lot of the stuff had been reported stolen. This meant McKeel could charge Brian and hold him in custody while she looked for a connection to Jack's case. And so that's what McKeel did. She arrested Brian for theft. However, she still wasn't totally sure if he'd actually played a role in Jack's murder. McKeel had basically convinced herself that Jack's nephew, Bradley, was the killer. But now, Brian had come out of left field, and he seemed like an equally strong suspect. And so McKeel wondered if maybe these two men had worked together, with Bradley actually committing the crime and then passing off the jewelry to Brian to sell. But McKeel had no evidence that these two men even knew each other. And until the ballistics results came back, she didn't even know if Bradley's gun was the murder weapon. It was like suddenly McKeel had gone from having a case full of dead ends to having a case with too many good suspects. It would take another week before the final piece of evidence fell into place. On August 4th, 2 weeks after Jack's death, McKeel got a call about a second pawn shop, where a young man had stopped in the day after the murder trying to sell a bunch of damaged jewelry. Unlike at the first pawn shop, the employee at this one had not realized the jewelry was stolen, so he had bought it. Police had already examined the jewelry and confirmed it belonged to Jack. But the most important thing about this pawn shop was that it did have a security camera. And when McKeel watched that footage, she knew who killed Jack. Based on that surveillance footage, evidence collected at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Jack Parks on the morning of July 21st, 2014. That morning, the killer woke up in agony. They lay in bed for several minutes, drenched in sweat. Their cramps were getting worse. And beneath the pain, a horrible, clawing hunger was growing, demanding to be fed. From the next room, their partner shouted that they were heading off to work. At this, the killer scrambled up, yelling for their partner to wait. The killer dragged themselves out of bed and stumbled from the room. With a wild look on their face, they told their partner to call in sick today. They were going for a ride. A short while later, at about noon, the couple pulled up to the curb 1 block from the Silver Star Meats factory. The killer eyed the house directly across from the factory. The garage was open, and Jack's car was inside. He was home. The killer reached inside the glove box and took out a .380 caliber handgun. They told their partner to drive away if they weren't back in 30 minutes. Then they pocketed the gun, pulled the hood of their sweatshirt over their head, and got out of the car. The killer's heart pounded as they hurried down the sidewalk, avoiding eye contact with the meat factory employees, just standing about in their blood-stained aprons. The killer reached Jack's house, headed up the walkway, went through the front gate, and right to the door. They knocked and then waited. When no one answered, they urgently knocked again. The door opened. Jack looked out and quickly waved the killer inside. Jack turned away from the door and asked the killer if he could get them something to drink. But the killer didn't answer. Instead, they followed Jack through the doorway and into the front room, and there they stopped, drew the gun from their pocket, raised the barrel just inches from Jack's right ear, and fired. The bullet struck Jack in the back of the head. He fell, dead before he even touched the ground. And immediately, the killer bolted upstairs to the master bedroom, where they tore through the dresser, ripping out drawers and dumping the contents all over the floor. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. They quickly dug through the room and found Carol's jewelry box and Jack's rings, chains, and watches. The killer stuck the items into the pockets of their sweatshirt, feeling a thrill of victory. Soon, that gnawing hunger would be satisfied. The pain would end. Then, the phone in the house began to ring, and the killer just froze. The killer listened as the call went to voicemail. Carol's voice echoed from the machine, asking why Jack wasn't picking up his cell phone, telling him that somebody was interested in buying his mother's house, and they needed to get there by 4 p.m. to open it up. Then Carol said she loved him and hung up. As soon as the voicemail ended, the killer rushed back downstairs to the front door. They grabbed the key off an end table to lock the deadbolt, but then something caught their eye. And once again, they froze. The killer saw Jack's feet jutting out from behind the coffee table. Beyond that, the killer saw the whole living room. It was a place with a lot of happy memories, where they, the killer, had spent countless slumber parties eating popcorn and watching movies with their cousins. A lump began to form in the killer's throat as they looked at a particular photo on the wall. Their 10-year-old self was smiling right back at them. The killer looked down at the floor, said goodbye to their Uncle Jack, and left. Jack's nephew, Bradley Johnson, had been high on Detective McKeel's suspect list. But when the results of the ballistics test on Bradley's .380 caliber handgun came back, it did not match the murder weapon. Also, at that second pawn shop where they had surveillance footage, it was not Bradley who McKeel saw, because Bradley didn't kill his uncle. Carol's nephew, the disgraced Army veteran Michael Lapaya, did. It would turn out Michael had been really struggling since his dishonorable discharge from the Army, even worse than some of his family knew. He'd started using heroin and begun stealing to support the habit. And as his addiction worsened, Michael became increasingly desperate for cash. And in July 2014, he saw a quick way to get it, by killing Uncle Jack and stealing his jewelry. Jewelry Michael pawned the next day for just a little over $1,000. Once Detective McKeel saw Michael on that pawn shop surveillance footage, she was sure she'd found Jack's killer. And soon after that, she dug into Michael's phone records and discovered that his phone had pinged off a cell phone tower near Jack's house around the time of the murder, not long before Michael had gone shopping with his girlfriend and to his medical appointment just to give himself an alibi. Eventually, Michael would confess to what he'd done. Michael was convicted of first-degree murder and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His girlfriend and alleged getaway driver was never charged. As for Brian Gibbons, the jewelry thief who Detective McKeel thought could be connected to this case, he was ultimately cleared of any involvement. The pawnshop owner who identified him had simply made a mistake. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. On a gray afternoon in late November of 1970, a 38-year-old man named Ivan Larson was hiking with his two young daughters in a narrow valley about 4 miles outside the city of Bergen. The older girl was 12, the younger one was 9. They had taken the bus out from the city that morning the way the family did most Sundays when the weather wasn't too bad. The valley they were walking through had a name. People in Bergen called it Isdalen, which in Norwegian means something close to the ice valley. The older name for it, the one the grandparents still used, was darker: Death Valley. Not because of anything recent. The name came from old stories from centuries back about travelers who had vanished in the snow, not something a family on a Sunday hike would think much about. It was cold that afternoon. Not freezing yet, the kind of cold where you can still smell the wet stone and the moss, and your breath shows up gray in front of your face. Avon carried a thermos of coffee. The girls had been quiet for a while, the way kids get when they're tired but don't want to say so. The trail curved between two large boulders. The younger daughter stopped walking. She told her father that something smelled strange. Ivan didn't think much of it at first. They were a long way from any road. There were no other hikers that day, no campfires, no smoke in the sky. He told his daughter it was probably an animal, maybe a fox, that had crawled somewhere and died. He told her to wait with her sister. Then he stepped off the path and walked toward the rocks. The smell got worse the closer he got. It wasn't the smell of an animal. He had grown up around livestock, around hunting season, around the smell of dead things. This was something else. There was a chemical edge to it, something like burnt fabric, something like gasoline. He came around the side of the larger boulder, and he saw her. She was lying between the rocks, partially shielded from the wind. Her body had been burned. Not completely. The fire had been intense, but localized. Her face and the front of her torso were charred almost beyond recognition. Her arms were folded across her chest in what looked at first glance like a careful pose, almost peaceful. But the things around her were not peaceful. Scattered near the body were about a dozen small pink pills, 2 empty plastic bottles still carrying the sharp chemical smell of gasoline. A passport burned down to a curl of black. A nylon stocking untouched. A small silver spoon, the kind you'd find on a hotel breakfast tray. And, lying across one of the rocks, folded neatly, completely undamaged by the fire, a purple silk scarf. Ivan backed away from the scene without taking his eyes off it. He walked his daughters down the trail without explaining what he had seen. When they reached a phone, he called the police. The first officers who arrived that evening looked at the body, looked at the pills, looked at the gasoline bottles, and quickly reached an early conclusion. A woman had hiked into a remote valley, taken sleeping pills, doused herself in gasoline, and lit a match. They said it was an unusual suicide, but a suicide. They wanted to close it fast. One detective on the scene was not satisfied. His name isn't important here. His instinct is, he noticed that the woman's hands were clean. No soot on her palms, no burn pattern on her fingers. None of the defensive damage you would expect from someone who had set themselves on fire. Her hands looked like the hands of someone who had been placed there. He pushed for an autopsy. He got one. The autopsy made things worse. She had soot deep in her lungs. That meant she had been alive when the fire was lit. There was bruising on the side of her neck in a pattern consistent with a heavy blow before the burning. The pills she had supposedly swallowed were only partially digested, not enough to have killed her. Not even enough to have knocked her fully unconscious. The fingerprints on her hands had been deliberately filed off days or weeks before her death. And every label on every piece of her clothing, every laundry tag, every brand mark, every factory symbol had been carefully cut out with scissors. Investigators returned to Bergen and began retracing her steps. She had checked into a hotel in the city center called Hotel Hordeheimen 5 days before her body was found. She had signed the register under the name Fenella Lorch. The desk clerk remembered her. She was in her 30s, dark hair, slight build. She spoke German with a faint accent the clerk couldn't quite place. She wore good clothes, the kind a businesswoman or a wealthy traveler might wear. One evening, she had left the hotel with 2 suitcases and never come back for her room key. Detectives found one of those suitcases 2 days later checked into a locker at the Bergen train station. They opened it. Inside were items that did not belong to a tourist. Wigs, 3 of them in different colors. Several thousand units of cash in 3 different currencies, Norwegian kroner, German marks, and Swiss francs. A notebook filled with what looked like a personal diary, except the entries were written in a code nobody on the police force could read. Maps of European cities with small marks penciled in at specific street corners, and a toothbrush. It was the toothbrush that bothered them the most. It was a standard travel toothbrush, the kind you could buy in any drugstore in Europe, except the brand name had been scraped off the handle with a knife, carefully, methodically. Until there was no way to identify where it had been manufactured or where it had been sold, the second suitcase was never found. The investigation widened. Interpol got involved. Detectives began comparing the woman's photo reconstructed from autopsy images against records across Europe. What they found stopped the case cold. In the 9 months before her death, the same woman had stayed in hotels in Paris, in Geneva, in Hamburg, in Stavanger, in Oslo, and in Trondheim. At every hotel, she had used a different name. Investigators eventually documented 8 separate aliases across 6 countries. Fenella Lorch was only the last one. Each identity had a passport. Each passport had been issued through a different channel. None of them matched any real person on any government registry. She had also, at one point, written a 500 kroner check at a Bergen department store drawn on a personal account. When detectives went to verify the account, they found that the issuing bank information on the check had been altered. The identifying numbers had been filed away with what looked like the same tool that had been used on the toothbrush. A waiter at the hotel restaurant remembered something else. The night before she disappeared, she had eaten dinner with a man. Older, well-dressed, foreign. They had spoken quietly. The waiter remembered the woman switching languages mid-conversation from German into something he thought might have been Italian, then back into German. The man with her was never identified. He paid in cash. He left no name. He was never seen again. 3 days after that dinner, a father on a Sunday hike smelled something strange between 2 rocks. The Norwegian police, after months of investigation, officially closed the case in early 1971. The ruling was suicide. The same ruling the first officers on the scene had wanted to give in the first place. There was political pressure in the background from agencies that did not want this case discussed in public. Bergen in 1970 was a sensitive city. NATO had naval listening posts in the fjords nearby. The Cold War was at one of its tense points. Whatever this woman had been doing, somebody preferred that the question simply stop being asked. But the question did not stop. Decades later, a new generation of forensic scientists reopened the file. A tooth had been kept from the original autopsy. They ran an isotope analysis on the enamel. The chemistry of tooth enamel records the specific minerals laid down during childhood, drawn from the local water and the local food. The result pointed to a very specific region. She had grown up somewhere in Central Europe, most likely in a town near the border between Germany and France, possibly Nuremberg, possibly somewhere just south of it. She would have been a child during the Second World War. A linguist later worked on her coded diary and confirmed it was a travelogue. But the dates in the diary did not match any visa records in any country under any of her 8 names. She had been moving through Europe without leaving an official footprint anywhere. To this day, she has not been identified. Her grave is in a cemetery on the outskirts of Bergen. There is no name on the stone. There is a number. Norwegian police still receive tips every few years from elderly people in different countries who think they once knew her, or once worked with her, or once shared a train compartment with her. None of those tips has ever led anywhere. The most likely reconstruction, the one that fits the most pieces of the evidence, is this. She knew she was being followed. She had maybe 72 hours. She left her hotel with 2 suitcases and walked or was driven into the valley. Whoever met her there either killed her or watched her die or helped her do something she had already decided to do. Then they took the second suitcase and disappeared. In all likelihood, she was a courier, or an operative, or a defector who got close enough to the wrong border to be erased. But all of that is theory. What is fact is this. A woman walked into Bergen carrying 8 names and walked out with none of them. A man had dinner with her and was never identified. A suitcase full of wigs and coded notebooks was left in a train station locker. A toothbrush had its brand scraped off with a knife, and a purple silk scarf, the only thing in that valley the fire didn't touch, was folded neatly on a rock beside her body. Nobody has ever been able to explain why she brought it, or why, of everything she owned, that was the one thing she didn't try to burn. From a frozen valley where nobody knew her name, we go now to the other side of the world, to a quiet dairy farm in New Zealand, a place where everybody knew the family living there. And as it turned out, that was the problem. On a damp evening in June of 1970, in a small farming district called Pukakawa in the lower Waikato region of New Zealand, a 30-year-old woman named Jeanette Crew was setting the table for dinner inside her farmhouse. Her husband Harvey was outside finishing the last of the milking. Their 18-month-old daughter Rochelle was already asleep upstairs in her cot. It was a Wednesday. The Crew farm sat at the end of a long gravel road surrounded on 3 sides by paddocks and on the 4th by a slow curve of the Waikato River. The nearest neighbor was about half a mile away across the fields. Harvey ran the dairy operation. Jeanette kept the books, raised the baby, and grew vegetables in a small garden beside the kitchen window. They were quiet people, well-liked, private. Inside the house that evening, the radio was on low. There was a roast in the oven, the table was set, and the cutlery was laid out the way it always was. 2 plates, 2 glasses, 2 sets of knives and forks. Beside the back door, Harvey's work boots were lined up neatly on a sheet of newspaper, the way Jeanette always insisted he leave them. A pot of tea was warming on the stove. The kitchen window looked out over the cow paddock. 5 days later, on the following Monday morning, a relative drove out to the farm to check on them. The family had not been seen at church on Sunday, which was unusual but not alarming. They had not answered the telephone, which was more unusual. The relative pulled into the driveway just after 9 in the morning. Harvey's car was parked where it always was. The front gate was open. The dog was tied up by the porch, thin and quiet. She knocked on the front door. No answer. She tried the handle. It was unlocked. Inside the house, she stood in the front hall and called out their names. Nothing. The kitchen radio was off. The roast was still in the oven, only it had been in there for several days. The cutlery was still on the table, the pot of tea on the stove had gone cold and brown and crusted at the bottom, and then, from upstairs, she heard a small, tired sound. It was the baby. Rochelle was awake in her cot. She was crying, but it was a weak sort of crying. The kind of cry a small child makes when she has been crying for a long time, on and off, and has more or less given up. The relative went up the stairs. The baby's diaper was clean, her face was a little flushed but not feverish. There was a half-full bottle of formula sitting on the rail of the cot. The formula in the bottle was still slightly warm. The relative stood in that bedroom holding the warm bottle and tried to make sense of what she was looking at. The roast in the oven had been there for days. The radio was off, which meant someone had turned it off after Jeanette had turned it on. The dog had been fed at some point, there was a half-empty bowl on the porch with fresh water beside it, and someone had been in this room, in this house, in the last few hours. Someone who knew the baby. She did not call out again. She picked up Rochelle, walked back down the stairs, and got into her car. She drove until she reached a neighbor's house, and she telephoned the police. By the afternoon, officers were walking through the farmhouse with their hats in their hands, trying to piece together what had happened. The first thing they noticed was the blood stain. There was a single dark stain on the carpet in the living room near the front of an armchair. It was not large. It had soaked into the wool and dried at the edges. There was another smaller stain on the wall beside the chair. The cutlery on the dinner table had not been moved. The plates had not been used. Whatever had happened inside that house had happened before dinner was served. But there was no sign of Jeanette. There was no sign of Harvey. Their wallets were upstairs. Harvey's wedding ring was on the bedside table where he always put it before milking. The police searched the property for 2 days. They searched the riverbank. They searched the outbuildings. They searched the surrounding paddocks. They found no bodies, no clothing, no shoes, no weapon. What they did find, eventually, were tire tracks behind the milking shed that didn't match Harvey's vehicle, and a faint, muddy footprint on the back step of the farmhouse near the kitchen door, adult-sized. Not Harvey's, not Jeanette's. The case became something the country could not stop talking about. A young couple, a baby left alone in a cot, a warm bottle of formula. The detail that fixed itself in the public mind more than anything else was the bottle. Someone had been inside that house. Someone had walked past whatever had happened in the living room, climbed the stairs, opened a baby's bedroom door, and fed an 18-month-old child, and then left. Over the next several weeks, investigators reconstructed what they could. Based on the state of the food in the oven, Jeanette had likely been killed on the Wednesday evening. Harvey had probably been killed shortly afterward outside near the milking shed. Both bodies had been removed from the property, but whoever did it had come back. Not once, multiple times. Someone had entered that house repeatedly over the course of 5 days, fed the child, and disappeared again before anyone noticed. The neighbors, when interviewed, could not remember seeing any unusual vehicles on the road. No one had seen lights in the farmhouse at night. No one had heard the dog bark. The dog, when the police examined it, had been fed during those 5 days as well. Whoever had been coming to the house was someone the dog did not consider a stranger. 2 months passed before the bodies were found. In August, a fisherman on the Waikato River caught his line on something heavy near a bend a few miles downstream. When the police pulled it out, they found Jeanette Crew. Her body had been weighted down with a car axle. A week later, divers recovered Harvey from a deeper section of the same river. He had also been weighted down with an axle. Both had been shot. Both had been killed with the same caliber of rifle, a .22. The community was small. Suspicion in a small community moves quickly. Within weeks, the police investigation had narrowed onto a single neighbor, a farmer in his 30s named Arthur Allen Thomas. Arthur lived less than a mile away. He had once, years earlier, dated Jeanette before she married Harvey. He owned a .22 rifle. The police took the rifle in for testing. They tested it. They tested it again. The results were not as clean as they wanted them to be. The bullets recovered from the bodies were consistent with a .22, but not specifically traceable to Arthur's weapon. The first round of forensic work did not produce a usable match. The case stalled. Then, several months after Arthur had first been interviewed, officers went back to his property to conduct another search of his garden. They had searched the same garden twice before, thoroughly, with metal detectors on their hands and knees over the course of several days. On this third search, an officer reached into the soil of a flower bed and pulled out a single spent cartridge casing, a .22 casing. It was sent to the lab. The lab determined that the casing had been fired from Arthur Allen Thomas's rifle. Arthur was arrested. He was charged with both murders. He was tried. He was convicted. He went to prison. The community accepted the verdict. Rochelle was raised by relatives. The farm was sold. Years passed. And in the slow way these things sometimes happen, a small group of people began to look more closely at the case. A retired detective pulled the original files. He sat with them for a long time. And the more he read, the more one specific detail bothered him. The garden where the cartridge had been found had already been searched, twice, by officers crawling on their hands and knees with detectors, and nothing had been there. And then suddenly, on the third search, in the same plot of soil, there it was. He commissioned an independent soil analysis on the casing. The results came back, and they were difficult to explain. The casing showed almost no corrosion, no oxidation, no weathering, none of the deterioration you would expect to see on a piece of brass that had been buried in damp New Zealand garden soil for months. It looked, the analyst said carefully, as if it had been placed in the ground very recently. A government inquiry was opened. Witnesses who had testified against Arthur were re-interviewed. One of them recanted. Another contradicted his earlier statement on specific details. A royal commission was eventually convened to investigate the conduct of the original police inquiry. The commission concluded, after years of hearings, that the cartridge casing had been planted. 2 detectives from the original investigation were formally found to have fabricated the evidence that had sent Arthur Allen Thomas to prison. Arthur was pardoned, he was released, he was paid compensation, and the country had to sit with what that meant. It meant that whoever had killed Harvey and Jeanette Crew was not Arthur Allen Thomas. It meant that the real killer had never been arrested. It meant that whoever had walked into that farmhouse on a Wednesday evening in June of 1970, shot 2 people, dumped them in the river, and then come back into the house repeatedly over the next 5 days to feed a baby in a cot, had been allowed to walk away. And that person, whoever they were, was still walking around. The investigation has never produced another suspect that the courts have been willing to charge. Theories have circulated for decades. Some of them involve people close to the family. Some of them involve people in the original investigation. None of them have ever risen above theory. The case remains officially unsolved. Rochelle grew up. She is now a woman in her 50s. She has spent most of her adult life trying to find out one specific thing. Not who killed her parents. That question she has more or less accepted may never be answered. The thing she wants to know is something smaller and stranger and harder to let go of. She wants to know who fed her, who came into that house in the dark while her parents were in the river and made sure she didn't die in her cot. Whoever it was, they knew the layout of the kitchen. They knew where the formula was kept. They knew which bedroom was hers. They knew how to warm a bottle without waking her. And they came back to do it again and again for 5 days. And then when they heard that a relative was coming out to the farm on Monday morning, they stopped coming. And they have never said a word about it since. From a farmhouse where someone quietly kept a child alive, we go now to a city 5 years later and half a world away. To a warm afternoon in Rome where 2 young women got into a car with 3 young men they barely knew. And one of those young women had a feeling before she ever sat down in the passenger seat that something about the afternoon was wrong. On a warm Monday afternoon in late September of 1975, a 19-year-old woman named Rosaria Lopez and her 17-year-old friend Donatella Colasanti were walking through a small piazza in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Rome. It was the kind of afternoon that came at the end of summer in that part of Italy. Bright, dry, a little dusty. The shops had reopened after the long midday closure. The piazza smelled of coffee and warm pavement. The 2 girls had known each other for years. Rosaria was the older of the 2, but only by a couple of years. She lived with her family in a modest apartment a few blocks away. Donatella lived nearby in a building just off the same square. They worked, they went to mass on Sundays, they helped at home, and on weekends, they sometimes met other young people in the piazza and talked about going somewhere, anywhere. Usually, they didn't go. That afternoon, they had been invited somewhere. The invitation had come a few days earlier from two young men they had met through a mutual acquaintance. The men were named Angelo and Gianni. They were in their early 20s. They drove nice cars. They wore tailored shirts. They spoke politely, almost formally, in a way that suggested money. They had told the girls about a party at a private villa on the coast in a town called San Felice Circeo, about an hour south of Rome. Rosaria wanted to go. The villa was supposed to have a swimming pool. The men had promised dinner. They had said other people would be there. Donatella was less certain. She had spent the morning trying to talk Rosaria out of it. There was something about the two men she could not put into words. Their manners were too smooth. Their interest in two girls from a poor neighborhood was a little too eager. She told Rosaria she had a bad feeling about it. Rosaria laughed at her. She told Donatella she was being silly. Rich boys were just boys. They liked them. That was the whole point. The girls had spent 2 hours that afternoon getting ready. They had borrowed clothes from each other. They had done their hair at Rosaria's kitchen table. When Angelo and Gianni pulled up in the piazza in a white Fiat 127 a little after 4 in the afternoon, the two girls walked over and got in. The drive south took longer than they had been told it would. The road out of the city emptied as the hour got later. The villages along the coast looked closed for the season. Donatella sat in the back seat and watched the towns thin out. At one point, she asked Angelo when they were going to arrive. He smiled at her in the rearview mirror and told her not to worry. The villa was just a little farther. The other guests were waiting. When the car finally turned off the coastal road and climbed a narrow private drive, Donatella looked up and saw the villa. It was large, white stucco walls, a high wrought iron gate. The property sat alone at the top of a small hill surrounded by pine trees. There were no other houses in sight. There were no other cars in the driveway. There were no lights on inside. Donatella looked at Rosaria. Rosaria did not look back at her. She was looking at the swimming pool. The men led them inside. The villa was cold. The shutters were closed. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the way wealthy families left their summer houses in the off-season. There were no other guests. The girls stood in the front hall and waited for an explanation. Angelo told them the others would arrive in a little while. He offered them a drink. Gianni went to lock the front door behind them. He did it casually, the way you might close a window before a rainstorm. Then the tone of the afternoon changed. It did not change all at once. It changed in small pieces. Angelo's smile narrowed. Gianni stopped speaking in his polite, formal way and started speaking in short, flat sentences. A third man arrived a little later through the back of the house. He was older than the other two, heavier, quieter. He did not introduce himself. He walked past the girls without looking at them and went into another room. What happened in that villa over the next 35 hours is something this script is not going to describe in detail. The investigators who reconstructed it later described it as one of the most brutal crimes in Italian post-war history. The girls were not allowed to leave. They were not allowed to call their families. They were kept in different rooms by turns. They were told more than once that they were not going home. By Tuesday evening, more than a day after they had first walked into the villa, Rosaria was no longer alive. The men had killed her. The way they had killed her and what they had done before is something the curates later spent months establishing. For the purposes of this story, what matters is what happened next. The three men had a problem. They had killed one girl. They had a second girl still alive who had seen everything. They needed to decide what to do with both of them. Donatella by this point had been beaten badly enough that the men were not sure if she was still conscious. They argued in the next room. She could hear them. She lay very still on the floor. She slowed her breathing. She closed her eyes most of the way. One of the men came back into the room and stood over her. He prodded her with his foot. He bent down. He checked for a pulse on her neck. She did not move. She did not make a sound. He stood back up. He told the others she was dead. The decision the men made then was a practical one. It was late at night. The villa was isolated, but it was not invisible. They could not leave two bodies in the house.
They wrapped Rosaria in plastic sheeting from the garage. They wrapped Donatella the same way beside her. They carried both of them out to the white Fiat parked in the driveway. They put them in the trunk together. Then they closed the trunk lid. They got in the front seats of the car, and they drove back to Rome. They drove for about an hour through the dark. They reached the outskirts of the city. They continued into a quiet residential neighborhood where one of the men's families owned an apartment. They parked the white Fiat along the curb on a narrow street called Via Pola. They left the trunk closed. They left the car locked. They got out, walked up to the apartment, and went inside. The plan, as the men later admitted, was to come back in the morning and dispose of the car and what was inside it. It was almost midnight by the time they sat down. The apartment belonged to relatives of one of them. There was food in the kitchen. The men were hungry. They had been awake off and on for almost 2 days. They turned on the lights. They sat at the table. And they began to eat dinner. Outside on the street, the white Fiat sat parked under a street lamp. The body of one young woman and the body of another young woman who was still alive lay in the trunk together. Donatella, inside the trunk, had not moved. She had not made a sound during the drive. She had not made a sound when the men got out of the car. She had heard them lock the doors. She had heard their footsteps fade. And then she had heard nothing at all. She was lying in the dark next to her dead friend. She did not know what street she was on. She did not know what city she was in. She did not know how long she had been inside the trunk. But she was alive. She made a decision that the investigators later said probably saved her life. She did not try to get out. She did not scream. She did not kick the trunk lid. She understood in a way that is difficult to fully imagine that if she made a sound and the men were still nearby, she would not get a second chance. So she lay still and she waited. She waited for footsteps that were not theirs. She waited for a voice. She waited for anyone to walk past the car. A little before 2 in the morning, a man named Adriano was walking his dog along Via Pola. He had been having trouble sleeping. The dog needed to go out. He came down the sidewalk past the row of parked cars. As he came up alongside the white Fiat, he noticed something on the pavement underneath the rear bumper. It was a small, dark puddle. He bent down. He touched it with the tip of his finger. It was wet. It was red. It was coming from inside the trunk of the car. Adriano walked quickly to a public phone box at the corner of the street. He called the police. A patrol car arrived about 10 minutes later. 2 officers stepped out, looked at the puddle under the car, looked at each other, and walked around to the back of the Fiat. One of them used a tool to force the trunk open. The lid lifted up, and in the light of the street lamp, lying on a bed of plastic sheeting next to the body of her friend, was a young woman with her eyes open, looking up at them. The first thing Donatella Colasanti said to the officer who opened the trunk was not a request for help. It was an address. She gave him the address of the villa in San Felice Circeo. She gave him the name of one of the men. She told him there were 3 of them. She told him to send people now because the men were probably still in the apartment upstairs in the building above where the car was parked. The officer radioed for backup. Within an hour, the apartment had been raided. 2 of the 3 men were arrested in the apartment that night. They were not in hiding. They had not even left the building. They were the sons of well-known, respected families. One of them was the son of a notary. One of them came from a family that owned a large construction business. They had grown up in a neighborhood called Perioli, which at the time was one of the wealthiest districts in Rome. The press, when it picked up the story the next day, gave them a nickname, I Periolini, the Perioli boys. The third man, the older one who had arrived through the back of the house, was named Andrea Gira. By the time the police reached the apartment, he was already gone. He had walked out of the building sometime in the night, possibly while the other 2 were eating dinner. He had access to documents. He had access to money. He had access to family connections that reached outside of Italy. By the time investigators understood who he was already on a ship headed south out of the country. The trial of the 2 men who had been arrested became one of the most watched legal proceedings in Italian history. Donatella testified. She testified clearly in detail without breaking down. She described what had happened in the villa. She named the men. She identified them. Both were convicted. One was sentenced to life in prison. The other received a shorter sentence and was paroled years later. He went on to commit another murder after his release. He was sent back to prison. The third man, Andrea Gira, was tried in absentia. He was convicted, but he was never caught. For decades, Italian authorities believed he was alive somewhere in North Africa, possibly in Morocco, working under a false name. Tips came in, investigations were opened. None of them produced him. He lived as a fugitive for almost 20 years. He died somewhere abroad before he was ever brought back to face the sentence. The exact circumstances of his death were not confirmed until decades after the crime. The case in Italy is known by the name of the town, the Circeo massacre. It became, in the years that followed, the trigger for a series of reforms in Italian law on violence against women. Until that point, certain crimes had been categorized in the legal code under offenses against public morality rather than offenses against the person. The trial and the way the country reacted to it forced that to change. The change took longer than it should have. But it happened in part because of what Donatella Colasanti was willing to say in open court. Donatella spent the rest of her life as a public figure. She gave interviews, she spoke at schools. She became a quiet but consistent voice in the long, slow argument that what had happened to her and to Rosaria had not been a personal tragedy or a private matter, but a crime, and a crime that the country had to look at directly. She did not soften the details when asked. She did not perform her grief. She answered questions plainly. She died in 2005 at the age of 47 from cancer. In one of the last interviews she gave, an interviewer asked her what the worst part of those 35 hours had been. He expected probably an answer about the villa, about what the men had done. Donatella thought about it for a long moment before she answered. She said the worst part had not been the villa. The worst part had been the trunk. The silence in the trunk. The hour in the dark, lying next to her dead friend, waiting for someone to walk by who would notice that something was wrong. 3 stories tonight. 3 different countries. 3 different decades. A woman in a frozen valley who refused, even in death, to let anyone learn her name. A baby alone in a farmhouse fed for 5 nights by a person who has never been identified. And a young woman in a car trunk on a quiet Roman street, holding her breath, waiting for a stranger to look down at the pavement and see the small red puddle under the bumper. 3 afternoons that began as ordinary afternoons. And then didn't. There is a temptation when you tell 3 crime stories in a single episode to treat them as a collection. 3 separate cases, 3 different countries, 3 different decades lined up next to each other because they happen to be interesting. The audience moves from one to the next, the way a person walks through a museum, pausing in front of each exhibit, then moving on. The cases themselves remain separate. They share a shelf. They do not share a meaning. I want to argue something different here. I want to argue that these 3 particular cases, the Isdal woman in 1970, the Crew murders in 1970, and the Circeo massacre in 1975, are not 3 separate stories at all. They are 3 angles on the same problem. And the problem is older than any of them, and it has not gone away. The problem is this. Most of the worst things that happen to people are not committed by strangers in masks. They are committed by, or covered up by, or made possible by the institutions and the relationships that the victims were taught to trust. And in each of these 3 cases, the actual horror is not the violence. The violence is awful, but the violence is also the part that everyone can see. The real horror is something quieter. It is the realization in each case that the systems that were supposed to protect these people did not fail by accident. They failed in a pattern, and the pattern repeats. Let me show you what I mean. The Isdal woman, a person who was allowed to disappear. The case of the Isdal woman is usually told as a Cold War mystery, a spy story. The wigs in the suitcase, the 8 passports, the coded diary, the scraped toothbrush, these are the details that get repeated because they are the details that suggest an answer. The answer they suggest is that she was an operative working for one side or another, and that her death was the end of an assignment that went wrong. Maybe. The forensic evidence is consistent with that theory. The behavioral evidence is consistent with that theory. The political pressure on the Norwegian police to close the case quickly is consistent with that theory. But notice what that framing does. It turns her into a category. Once she becomes a spy, she stops being a person. Once she stops being a person, her unidentified status becomes interesting rather than terrible. We get to be fascinated rather than disturbed. The story becomes a puzzle, and puzzles are entertaining. Now, strip the Cold War context away. What you have is this. A woman in her 30s walked into a city, ate dinner with a man whose name nobody recorded, and 3 days later was found burned to death in a valley outside town. Her hands had been disfigured before her death. Her fingerprints had been filed off. The labels on her clothing had been cut out with scissors. She was killed in a manner designed to delay or prevent identification by someone with the skill and the patience to make those preparations. And then the official investigation, under pressure from agencies that were not part of the police force, ruled her death a suicide and closed the file. That is not a spy story. That is a description of a system working exactly the way it was designed to work. Someone decided this woman should not be identified. The people with the authority to identify her agreed. The case was closed in 2 months. Decades passed. New forensic tools became available. They were applied. They told us roughly where she had grown up. They did not tell us her name because by the time those tools existed, every person who might have known her was either dead or had reasons not to come forward. The fascinating part of the Isdal woman case is not who she was. The fascinating part is that 55 years later, in a country with one of the most competent police forces in Europe, we still do not know. Not because the information is unrecoverable, because the institutions that could have recovered it chose not to. She was, in a literal sense, allowed to disappear. The institutions that allowed it have never been held accountable because the institutions that would do the holding are the same ones that made the decision. The Crew murders, a case where the police were the crime. The Crew murders are the simplest of the 3 cases to describe and the hardest of the 3 to sit with. A couple was killed in their farmhouse in rural New Zealand. Their bodies were dumped in a river. Their 18-month-old daughter was left in her cot, and for 5 days someone returned to the house repeatedly to feed her. The bodies were eventually recovered. A neighbor was arrested. A cartridge casing was produced from his garden. After 2 previous searches of the same garden had turned up nothing, he was convicted on the basis of that casing. He went to prison. He served 9 years. He did not do it. That last sentence is not a theory. It is the conclusion of a Royal Commission of Inquiry conducted by the New Zealand government, which determined after years of hearings that the cartridge had been planted in the garden by police officers from the original investigation. Arthur Allen Thomas was pardoned. He was paid compensation. The detectives who had planted the evidence were named. Stop for a moment and think about what this means. It does not just mean that the police got the wrong man. It means that 2 detectives working a high-profile double homicide decided at some point in the investigation that they would manufacture evidence to convict a person they believed was guilty but could not prove was guilty. It means they planned this. It means they obtained a cartridge case from somewhere, most likely from a rifle that had been seized as evidence, and they buried it in soil that they knew would later be searched. It means they did this because they had decided that their judgment about who committed the crime was more reliable than the evidence the crime had actually produced. And it means something worse. It means that whoever actually killed Harvey and Jeanette Crew walked away. The real killer has never been identified. Every year that the wrong man spent in prison was a year that the right person spent free. Every resource the New Zealand justice system poured into prosecuting Arthur Thomas was a resource it did not pour into finding the actual murderer. The detectives who planted the casing did not just frame an innocent man, they closed the case. They made it impossible to ever solve. This is the part of the story that does not fit into a clean 3-act structure. There is no resolution. The killer is still out there or was out there long enough to die of old age. The daughter has spent her entire adult life trying to find out who fed her in her cot during those 5 days. The detectives who corrupted the case have largely passed into history without facing serious consequences. The community moved on. And the case has become, in a quiet way, the answer to a question that nobody likes to ask. The question is, how often does this happen? How often, in cases that do not become national scandals, do police officers decide that their gut is more accurate than the evidence and act accordingly? The Crew case is famous because the planting was eventually proven. We do not know how many cases like it exist where the planting was never proven because the man who was framed did not have the resources or the family or the public attention to fight back. The Crew murders are not a story about a killer. They are a story about a system that, when it could not solve a crime, decided to invent a solution. And the system suffered almost nothing for having done so. The Circeo massacre, a case where money was supposed to be enough, the Circeo massacre is the most violent of the three cases. It is also the one with the clearest answer. The men were identified. 2 of them were convicted within months. The survivor testified. The facts were established beyond any reasonable doubt. There is, in the legal sense, no mystery here. But there is something that has to be named about this case because it is the thing the 3 men were actually counting on. They believed before that night, during that night, and after that night that their families would protect them. They believed this with the confidence of people who had been protected their entire lives. They were the sons of professionals, a notary, a successful businessman in a city, and a decade where those professions came with a kind of social armor. They had grown up in Perioli, which was not just a wealthy neighborhood, but a specifically connected one. They had political affiliations on the far right that, in Italy in 1975, were not yet considered disqualifying in polite society. 2 of them had been previously involved in violent incidents. Nothing had come of any of it. They drove a young woman they had killed and a young woman they thought they had killed back to Rome in the trunk of a car. They parked the car on a residential street near their family's apartment. They went upstairs and ate dinner. They did not bury the bodies. They did not drive into the countryside. They did not even hide the car in a garage. They left it on the street. Why? Because they did not believe in any serious way that they were going to be punished. The plan, such as it was, involved coming back in the morning and figuring out what to do with the car. The plan assumed that a parked car in a respectable neighborhood owned by a young man from a good family would not be examined too closely. The plan assumed that even if it was examined, the families would step in. Lawyers would be called, the papers would be handled. The matter would go away. The plan was not stupid. Versions of that plan had worked for people like them for as long as Italy had existed. The reason it did not work that night was not because the system that had always protected men like them suddenly decided to behave correctly. The reason it did not work was because a young woman they had badly underestimated lay completely still in the dark for an hour and a half, slowing her breathing, waiting for the sound of a stranger's footsteps instead of doing what almost any human being in that position would have done, which is panic. Donatella Colasanti was the variable they had not accounted for. Without her, the white Fiat would have been moved before dawn, the bodies would have been disposed of, the men would have continued having dinners. This is what the Circeo case is actually about. It is not about 3 monsters. There have always been 3 monsters. The case is about the infrastructure that those 3 monsters had every reason to expect would absorb the consequences of what they did. The case became a turning point in Italian law, not because the country was shocked that men could be cruel, but because the country was forced to look at the assumption underneath the cruelty, the assumption that some people could do this kind of thing and walk away, and that the legal system would help them walk away because the legal system had been written by people who lived in the same neighborhoods and went to the same dinners. The 3rd man, Andrea Ghira, walked away anyway. He left the country before dawn. He lived as a fugitive for almost 20 years. He died abroad, never extradited, never tried in person. The other 2 served sentences, though. One of them was paroled and went on to murder again before being returned to prison. The system bent. It did not break. It bent enough after Donatella's testimony that the legal definition of what had been done to her could finally be called what it was. But the men who designed that system and the families that benefited from it were not removed from the rooms where decisions get made. They are still in those rooms. The names have changed, the rooms have not. What these three cases share, I want to name the thread now because I think it is worth naming directly. In the Isdal case, an institution decided who would not be identified. In the crew case, an institution decided who would be punished regardless of who had actually committed the crime. In the Circeo case, three young men correctly understood that an institution had been built over generations to protect people who looked like them from the consequences of doing exactly what they did. In all three cases, the violence is the part of the story we remember. The valley, the farmhouse, the villa, the fire, the river, the trunk. These are the images. These are what get repeated. But the violence is not actually the most disturbing element of any of these three cases. The most disturbing element in each one is the slow institutional silence that surrounded the violence and shaped how it was investigated, prosecuted, and remembered. In Norway, the silence was political. In New Zealand, the silence was procedural. In Italy, the silence was social. The flavors were different. The function was the same. The function was to make sure that certain truths did not become part of the official record, because those truths would have required the institutions to ask harder questions about themselves than they were willing to ask. This is the value, I think, of telling these three cases in a single episode. Separately, each one looks like an unusual case. A spy mystery, a miscarriage of justice, a class crime. Together, they look like something else. They look like a description of how institutions actually behave when they are asked to confront a crime that does not flatter them. They protect themselves first, they protect the people who built them second. They protect the victims when they protect them at all last. This is not a comforting conclusion. It is not supposed to be. It is the reason these cases are still being talked about more than 50 years after they happened. Not because the violence was unusual. Violence is not unusual. They are still being talked about because in each one, an ordinary person was failed by something much larger than the person who hurt them. And the larger thing has never really had to answer for it. That is the part of these stories that is worth remembering after the lights are back on and the episode is over. This essay was written as a companion piece to the episode covering the Isdal woman, the crew murders, and the Circeo massacre. Where the script focused on the moment-to-moment experience of each case, this analysis steps back to ask what the three cases have in common and what that commonality is telling us.